because I'd like to see you. I can't see anybody sitting down here. Okay, so it's a great honour to be here, and gosh, what a crowd. I didn't expect such a large crowd this evening. And I'm going to talk about this practice, which, as many of you will know, I'm probably not speaking to the unconverted here, will know of mindfulness in the Western world and its impact in the Western world. When 8-week mindfulness courses are taught, one of the things that's usually said very fleetingly, and I think rightly so, because that's not what people are there for, is that this practice has its origins in the Buddhist tradition. Yeah? And then it's usually on with the practice and what you're about to do. And so what we find, this was the title of my talk, is that mindfulness, I'll come to reason why we want to translate this as present moment awareness, or even another phrase which I'll use, why this has become so dominant, so important in the Western world. It has. A lot of my time these days is spent actually teaching mindfulness teachers about mindfulness, particularly on retreat situations in the Buddhist tradition, and trying to connect the Buddhist psychological viewpoints with viewpoints that they understand coming often from modern science. One of my experiences when I first started teaching at Oxford, because I'm co-director of the Master of Studies degree in Oxford in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and in the early days when we first started teaching, I used to have one of the main CBT therapists who's really well known in the CBT world, sitting in on the course, and she used to say after virtually every sentence, "That's just like CBT. That's just like CBT." So there's obviously a congruence. There's something coming together here, and it's speaking to something that's needed, I think, in the Western world, and they say it's become very, very dominant. These days I get so fed up with the word mindfulness because it's ubiquitous, isn't it? It's all over the place. And you come across the mindfulness-based colouring book, mindfulness-based brewing. It gets ridiculous. It's something that's been taken over, and it's become part almost of an industry, I think. But what I want to focus on this evening is, why is that happening? Why is this ancient tradition somehow speaking to a need in the Western world at the present moment? So I want to draw on a number of sources. I want to draw on, obviously, some early Buddhist sources, and I will say this is from early Buddhism. And what I mean by early Buddhism is really the Buddhism that we find within Pali texts. Yeah, so I'm not referring to other forms of Buddhism. This is not a criticism of other forms of Buddhism, but it's just saying this is where we can find this rooted very, very deeply into these early texts. But I want to start also, with a quotation, actually not from something Buddhist, but from the Western world, which I think gives us a sense of why perhaps this is speaking to us. I'll let you decide what you think about this. This is a quotation from a French thinker, 17th century, so it's not exactly recent, called Pascal, Blaise Pascal. Many of you will know him as a mathematician, but he was also a philosopher, and his very famous work, De Pensée, has this particular quotation in it. It's not that long. "We never keep to the present. We recall the past. We anticipate the future as if we found it too slow in coming and were trying to hurry it up. Or we recall the past as if to stay its too rapid flight. We are so unwise that we wander about in times that do not belong to us and do not think of the only one that does. So vain that we dream of times that are not and blindly flee the only one that is. The fact is that the present usually hurts. We thrust it out of sight because it distresses us, and if we find it enjoyable, we're sorry to see it slip away. We try to give it the support of the future and think, how are we going to arrange things over which we have no control for a time we can never be sure of reaching? Let each of us examine their thoughts. They will find them wholly concerned with the past or the future. We almost never think of the present, and if we do think of it, it is only to see what light it throws on our plans for the future. The present is never our end, The past and the present are our means, the future alone our end. Thus we never actually live, but hope to live. And since we're always planning how to be happy, it's absolutely inevitable that we shall never be so. Yeah. Does that speak as a kind of contemporary diagnosis? Yeah. Although it's the 17th century, I think it speaks very much to the situation that a lot of people find themselves in the contemporary world. Being encouraged to, well, not even perhaps so much ruminate on the past, but constantly think about the future. You know, planning. Have you ever had that one? Yeah. Has that ever been a problem for you? Planning, waking up in the night, planning. Yeah. And one of the big plannings that we often have is, and I think Pascal mentions this at the end of that quotation, is how are we going to be happy? How do we plan to be happy? There is something in contemporary psychology, which some of you will know, called discrepancy-based processing. Yeah, have you come across this? Anybody familiar with this term, discrepancy-based processing? It's actually how rational thought works. It's how to solve problems. And what you do is try to solve a problem between where you are and where you would like to be. So my problem this evening was I live somewhere up in North Worcestershire near Birmingham and had to be in Bath. So I had to plan. You know, plan to bridge the gap between being there to being here. Yeah. So it's something we can do, isn't it? It's something that's rationally doable by all of us when we have that kind of problem. It's problem solving. And let's not mistake this. This is a fantastic aspect of the way our minds work. However, what tends to happen is we end up applying that same form of thinking to areas where it doesn't have any purchase. Such as, I feel unhappy, in a low mood, and I would like to be happy. And we go about planning in the same way. Planning how to be happy. Does it make sense? Yeah? So we're trying to bridge the gap between whatever mood you're in now to a mood I'd like to be in. Yeah? We have an explosion in the Western world, something that the World Health Organization says is going to probably be the second biggest health problem in the next few years. I mean, not in the very distant future. And that is depression. Yeah? This is a huge issue in the Western world. Some of you, I don't want to kind of go on about this part of it because I want to get to the Buddhist side of it, but many of you will know that the reason why mindfulness-based approaches came about, certainly in the UK, not so much in the States, but in the UK, was to deal with the recurrence of depressive relapse. People who have depression will suffer from a further bout of depression, and probably throughout their lives, once you've had one bout of depression. Another frightening statistic, I just want to give you the frightening statistics to start with. Another frightening statistic is the first onset for depression in the Western world was generally around about 25 years ago, was age 52. Yeah? First onset of depression now is round age 13 to 15. Yeah? So we're not talking about the older end of the spectrum, we're talking about young people. And hear that remark that I made earlier, if you've had one bout of depression, you're probably going to have frequent bouts of depression if it goes untreated. And the way that the Western world knows how to treat it is obviously through drugs. Yeah, can be effective, and certainly I wouldn't want to poo-poo it, but of course they lose their effectiveness over the time, and sometimes they have side effects, yeah, particularly for people. So we have the problem, we have a kind of a solution that we find in conventional medical approaches, but we also have another, in a way, not solution, but way of approaching this problem in the Western world that comes from this very ancient tradition. Yeah? Now, I won't claim, of course, that the Buddha was really just treating people with depression. Yeah? That was not his kind of remit. That's not what he went around doing. But let's go back to the quotation from Pascal. The present usually hurts. That's the same starting place for the Buddha, in this ancient tradition. The Buddha starts off with trying to analyse something and look at something which is there in human life. I'm going to use the Pali term simply because in a way it's untranslatable, and most of you who've come across books on Buddhism will have found it translated with one word. It doesn't work as a one-word translation, unfortunately. This word in Pali, as it is in Sanskrit as well, is the word dukkha. Yeah? The word dukkha is generally translated as suffering. Yeah? Going back to my Pascal, it hurts. However, the hurting here is everything from minor irritation to tragedy that can occur in your existence. Yeah? And he starts off with some basic existential facts. Yeah? Something I kind of remind myself every time I look in the mirror every morning is there is aging, there is sickness, and at the sort of risk of depressing you all, although I'm talking about the alleviation of depressing, there is death. Yeah? As Woody Allen once said, I don't want to live on in the memories of others, I want to live on in my apartment. So we have these existential issues, and these are all included as part of dukkha. These are inescapable, aren't they? These are inescapable issues. There's something in a way that are not optional. Aging, sickness, death, these are not optional. Yeah. We can do our best to look after ourselves, but we will still continue to age. We can do our best to look after ourselves, and we'll still continue to get sick. And at some point, no matter how old you live, you are going to die. So that's inescapable, and I just kind of want to leave it at that. Because if we're not really addressing those problems tonight, what I want to address is the problems of what I call optional dukkha. Yeah? Now, the optional dukkha might be related to those existential issues, but they're not about the existential issues per se. And what I mean by that is they're related to it because they're the rumination that often takes place around those issues. And they often take place around the issues about how to be happy. Yeah? If I've got that as a question for myself, it generally means I'm dissatisfied. Yeah? And the Buddha was trying to say something, because this is the starting point for all mindfulness-based approaches, and actually for the Buddhist tradition itself. The Buddha is really trying to say is actually everybody is in this situation of experiencing dukkha. Whether it's that ones we don't have a choice about, or the aspects of dukkha that we don't have a choice about, or pain, suffering, distress, disease, illness, loss. All of these are going to affect us in our lifetime, aren't they? But there are also aspects of our dissatisfaction which we have choices about. Yeah? We can approach it differently. Now, much of this, particularly in contemporary culture, is driven by contemporary culture, isn't it? Contemporary culture fosters dissatisfaction. I don't know if that is apparent to you. It fosters it in some of the attitudes. I just want to give you one other Western quote before going on to some of the more Buddhist material. But this is from another novelist, actually, somebody called Milan Kundera. Some of you might know his novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And he says this. He said, speed, the demon of speed, is often associated with forgetting, with avoidance, and slowness with memory, with confronting. We move slowly when we want to listen to ourselves. We move slowly when we want to listen to others and the world around us. We move slowly when we want to accept ourselves. The rush of contemporary life overwhelms us, and our ability to observe, to hear, to step back and to wonder. Society wants to blow out the tiny, trembling flame of memory. It's quite a big condemnation, isn't it, of contemporary life? And this was written in the early 70s. Now, there's words that are used there, I think, which are really interesting in relationship to mindfulness, because one of the meanings of the original Pali word that the Buddha uses for the term mindfulness, the word sati, some of you might be familiar with this, others not, actually derived from a Sanskrit word which means to remember, to recollect, actually, to recollect something. In ancient Indian traditions, recollection was associated with historical memory, the sort of stuff that we rummage around in our memories and try to remember what went on, X number of years ago. Yeah? I'm sure you're all familiar with that kind of memory there. It was very much used in the Indian tradition to refer to historical memory, particularly in relationship to learning something from the past. Yeah. So the great Indian epics that some of you have probably heard of, called the Mahabharata, largest poem in the world, by the way, if you know this, largest poem, absolutely enormous. It says about itself, what's not in here is not worth knowing. It's that big. I forget how, when I was staying and living in India at one point, they were televising it on Indian television in 268 episodes. Or something like that. It was a huge number of episodes. And something called the Ramayana, which actually, we had Diwali the other week, which is actually part of the celebration that comes from the Ramayana. All of these are considered to be part of history, in a sense, memory, remembering something. Now, what the Buddha cleverly does is he uses this sense of memory, remembering something, recollecting something, and brings it into, can you recollect what you're doing in the moment? In this moment? Do you know where your mind is at this moment? Is it, for example, listening to me, or is it thinking about what you're going to do later? Now, that's not meant to test you, by the way. That's just meant to be, this is what our minds do, isn't it? We often go off and plan, even when I'm trying to do something else. There's this disaster in the Western world that we call multitasking. It's usually a recipe for doing nothing well. And what that generally means is you've got split mind. You're trying to do one thing and you're also trying to do this and you're trying to do something else, and usually, as I say, it's not a very good recipe for getting things done well. But let's come back to this primary meaning of the Buddha is really honing in on, which is the sense of remembering what you're doing. So if you can engage in a task and in a sense be focused on that task, not to the exclusion of your mind wandering, but know when your mind is wandering and have the ability to bring it back. Bring it back to that task at the moment. And actually, you heard the translation when John read out the title here, Present Moment Recollection. This is what generally gets translated as mindfulness. The term sati that gets translated as mindfulness is much better served by this present moment awareness or present moment recollection. Recollection actually, although it wasn't in the title of the talk, it was actually the awareness word I used there, is actually a sense of gathering together, isn't it? Something that's fragmented and scattered, you can bring it back together. It's this beautiful image that we can have of sheep being rounded up by the sheepdog. They can be scattered all over the hillside. You've probably seen this, haven't you? Some of you walk, perhaps, have seen this when the sheepdog is rounding up the sheep to bring them and move them from one field to another. They'll be all over the place. And generally what it's doing is collecting them together back into a flock, then to move them. So part of what these contemporary mindfulness approaches are doing in the initial stages is actually training that ability. And that's what the Buddha was doing. He was saying we have this ability to gather our minds, for them not to be scattered, not to be constantly planning. Interestingly, according to these ancient texts, they are 2,500 years old, but according to the ancient text, somebody came across some of the Buddha's monks, his bhikkhus and his nuns. These were his followers in the time. And he said, why is it these people look so contented? And the Buddha just said, it's because they don't think about the future and they're not thinking about the past. They're not dwelling on the future and they're not dwelling on the past. It doesn't mean, of course, that we don't plan, but it means that we don't have to be constantly planning. We don't have to be constantly going back to a past to find something meaningful in our past experience, which is often why we revisit it, isn't it? Either something painful, which gives rise to things like anger and resentment and all those sort of kind of negative emotions, or going back because it was a happy memory and it's painful now. Does this make sense to everybody? So what these contemporary approaches and what the Buddha was suggesting there is a way of, in a sense, collecting the mind back again, being able to focus it and to be able to shift attention at will. Yeah? That would be a nice one, wouldn't it? To be able to shift our attention at will. One of the things that we have as a nice little phrase in the kind of more contemporary mindfulness approaches is that when you start to do mindfulness-based meditation, let's call it that for the moment, when you begin to do any kind of mindfulness-based meditation, you just suddenly discover that your mind has a mind of its own. Yeah? You might be given really simple instructions, and the instructions are really simple. And some of you probably, many of you have probably done meditation. The instructions are not complicated, are they? There's nothing particularly esoteric about them. And equally so in, obviously, these more secular-based approaches, there's nothing complex or esoteric about them. They're very simple tasks. For example, let me just give you a very simple example here. To basically focus on the sensations of breathing and to notice when your mind is wandering, to know where it's gone, whether that's to, another sensation, a thought, a sound, whatever it may be, wherever your mind has gone, to know where it's gone, and once having acknowledged where it's gone, to bring it back, to rest again on the sensations of breathing. Can you imagine the amount of difficulties people have, those really simple instructions? Because it sounds so simple, doesn't it? Yeah? All I've got to do is kind of notice where my mind goes, bring it back, and notice where my mind goes. What happens generally for most people, certainly in the early stages of meditation, is it doesn't remain with the breath, and it's not necessarily meant to remain with the sensations of breathing, but they also don't notice where their minds have gone. They don't notice where their minds have gone. They don't notice it's suddenly caught up in the thought because they're way off in the thought. They don't notice that they're planning for supper. This is what our minds do. And this is not a condemnation of the way that we normally approach things, but just saying, let's notice this, let's see what's going on here. I always think about meditation as being a wonderful experiment. Close your eyes. Actually, there's a wonderful quote by a Sri Lankan monk who says, this is meditation. Close your eyes and welcome to the madhouse. Because that's actually what's going on. There's a lot of chaos in there, isn't there? And what this is starting to do is slightly starting to calm down the chaos. So actually, the first stage of this process that the Buddha is recommending is to see the chaos as chaos. Now, I'm using that word very loosely, so please don't get attached to it. I'm using that word very loosely. What we find out is there's a lot going on, isn't there, in our experience? And we'll get caught up with this bit, and then we'll get caught up with that bit, and suddenly pulled to a sensation, to a sound outside, to, that thought that comes in your head that you think you've got to solve right now. That's what happens. That's our experience. There's a very good expression, it goes right back to these early texts. It said that the mind is monkey mind. It's like the monkey swinging through the branches of a tree. Trying to find a place to rest, but it doesn't. It just keeps on swinging. Going from tree to tree, from branch to branch, and it doesn't find actually anywhere it can settle that it's comfortable with. So, let me just try and sum up what I've just said so far. We've got a sense of primary discomfort that I think is recognised in this ancient tradition. The Buddha has this very particular term for it, which is this term dukkha, which means anything from dissatisfaction, minor irritation. In fact, if there's something you want changed right now, by the way, any of you sitting out there, if there's anything you want changed right now, this is not a thought experiment, but if there's anything you want changed, that's dukkha. Do you want me to talk a little bit louder, a little bit less? If you want the heating turned down, if you want the chair a bit more comfortable, if you're perched on the back here, you'd actually rather have a seat. This is dukkha. It's not on the sort of scale of things. It's not huge, is it? It's not the tragedy. It's not losing somebody you love. It's not losing somebody you care for. But that can also be dukkha as well. But actually, we spend our life a lot in this sense of irritation. Yeah? Like a background to our experience, like that little bit of sandpaper, friction in our experience. We find this going on a lot. In my early days involved, as some people I know in the audience know, I was involved a lot with Tibetan Buddhism and studied a lot in India. And I remember one of the Dalai Lama's tutors saying, he said, dukkha wasn't like being stabbed. It wasn't really sharp and painful all the time. What it was, he said, was like slowly rubbing your arm against a brick wall. It's a good image, isn't it? You know, if you think about rubbing your arm against a brick wall, it probably doesn't start off very painful. Keep on doing it, it gets really painful. So one of the other things we're looking at here is a circularity to your experience. You know? Ever felt that you end up in the same places? Mm-hmm. Now, most of us don't want to, but we have kind of limited tools in our repertoire to, in a sense, stop us from ending up in the same places. Now, I don't mean identical places, but something very, very similar. And that's that sense of repetition. Trying to solve the problems of life in the same ways, because we have this limited repertoire. And one of the big ways that we know is either looking at the past or going into the future, but not being here, not being present at this moment. So, what's coming out for contemporary mindfulness practices, this ancient tradition in the modern world, is the sense that we don't have to be doing that constantly. We don't have to be living at the speeds with which we live. I don't know if any of you, these days I particularly feel that I'm compelled into sort of a fastness of having to do things, everything. You know, we have all of this communication, which is great in some senses, but also a tremendous burden, isn't it? That it demands so much of us. You know, people don't want just an email tomorrow, they want it now. You know, so we're kind of speeding up in our societies. And that's maybe inevitable, and we can't necessarily fight the inevitable. You know, this is the way society's going. But here's a question. I'll pose it as a rhetorical question at this stage and hopefully go back and look at it a little bit later. Is it possible to live in a speedy world with slowness? With a degree of stillness? That, in a sense, is the question. What mindfulness-based approaches and the Buddha's original teaching was attempting to do, obviously he never lived in a society that was moving at the speed with which we do. You know, his society was basically a little area of northeast India, and he wouldn't have known much about what was going on in the rest of India. You know, it was confined to that particular region, and literally which he could walk around on foot. You know, the Buddha spent most of his life tramping around this particular area of northeast India. So not exactly the same problems, but there's this tendency of that human mind, isn't there, to want to keep on doing things. And this is what we find that's coming through in a sense of this connectivity over 2,500 years. There's a tendency of the human mind to scatter, project, move into the future, and to dwell in the past. Yeah? A German philosopher, Heidegger, once said that human beings are always ahead of themselves. You know? We're always out there ahead of ourselves, always planning. Yeah? I wouldn't be surprised if you planned the rest of your evening after this talk. You know, or at least have a vague idea about what you're going to be doing, or how you're going to get home. You know? Some of that might be sensible, some of it might not be. I'll leave you to judge that. But what is actually being said, there is something that we can learn to do to gather that mind, to recollect, to become collected, settled, rather than what goes with that sense of fragmentation, which is another particular, I think, problem in the Western contemporary world, which is agitation. Agitation. You know, it might not literally be the channel hopping that we do with the TV, but we're doing this with thing to thing. Trying to find some place to settle. That's that monkey mind again. Trying to find some place to settle. So we channel hop with our minds. Yeah. Looking for, I think I'll do that. No, I won't. No, I'll do something else. No, that's not working. I'll do something else. Yeah? Ever suffered from that one? Yeah? I'm obviously talking in generalities, so you have to try and apply this to your own situation. Yeah? And obviously some will, some won't in these situations. But what is being offered in this ancient practice is a way of gathering that mind and being able to settle. And, importantly, not just to have that, and not to stop thought, but also to learn something. Yeah? Also to learn something from this. Often the way mindfulness is portrayed in the West, and it's portrayed as a technique. That's really interesting. This is the difference between the ancient world and the modern world. Because of the way it's taught, and we teach it through 8-week, 2-hour sessions, 2 hours, over an 8-week period, in a sense it's a manualised program that's repeatable. So you can take it and you can do it with different groups. And it has to be done in that particular way. But it gives the impression that it's a technique rather than more than a way of living. Yeah? And I think what the Buddha is trying to convey is sati is an option of living that we have available to us. And I might say, although this is a Buddhist group and we're celebrating a Buddhist anniversary here, or the anniversary of this particular group, in a way, mindfulness, I'm going to use the old term here. My phrases are never going to catch on, no matter how much I try. Yeah. Mindfulness isn't Buddhist. It's human. Yeah. It's a human quality. And what the Buddha really was doing, it was actually picking out the qualities that you know, qualities that you've had. Sometimes in your life you will have known that you will have settled. The mind will have been a little stiller. You'd have been focused. Now that might be doing your favourite pastime. It might be painting, gardening, whatever it may be, watching cinema. You know that the mind is settled, it's focused, it's there. It's there with what's going on. But at other times we would have experienced it as being scattered and fragmented and agitated. Does that fit with most people's experience? So what he's trying to say is there's something within our experience that we've already tasted. If we go back to the kind of legend of the Buddha, and it is a legend, as much as anything, it's not history in the real sense of the word. It's a legend that tells us something about what's important. It says that the Buddha discovered this himself by sitting under a tree watching somebody ploughing. In other words, the mind settled. He learned something about how, what qualities that he had that he could develop. So this is not, as I say, Buddhist in scare quotes, but much more a sense of a human quality that can be developed by all of us. And this was very much in line with the message of the Buddha, that this wasn't restricted to any race, creed, sex, or whatever. This was something that everybody had the ability to do. His kind of invitation was, in a way, come and have a go. He's actually a little bit more eloquent though. He says ehipasiko, which is actually the Pali, which means come and look and see for yourself. Because that's the only real way to test it, not by dialectically trying to convince you that this is good, but just having a go, seeing what your mind does when you try to settle. Now, if that was the end of the story, I don't think it would be a very good story. Because actually, if we settle our minds, initially what we're going to find out is they're not settled, really. And what we have is a better view of the mess. That's all. So, actually what we're doing is learning something from this. Learning also what we can develop, what we can cultivate in our lives, and also, in a sense, I'm going to use this, but I'm using it very guardedly because I don't actually like the expression. Learning also to what we can drop or let go of. Now, I think there's a very interesting image about this. And I'll give you a kind of traditional view. This word meditation, by the way, everybody familiar with it? Yeah, I'm sure you all are. Word meditation. Buddhists don't meditate, actually. They cultivate. The Buddha himself lived in an agrarian society. He used expressions and phrases and I'm not going to go into much of this because we haven't got any time really this evening, but he used expressions and phrases which were tied to an agricultural society. It was a society that was in transition, moving towards more settled urban societies, but primarily still agricultural. So if you actually said to somebody ordinarily, actually what you're going to do is cultivate a quality of your mind. The word that's actually used in Pali, I'm not going to give you too many Pali words, but in these ancient texts is the word bhavana. This is the word that usually gets translated as meditation. Yeah. As I always like to say, the word bhavana speaks Indian languages, the word meditation speaks Latin. Yeah. It has a very different connotation. The word bhavana, let me just concentrate on that word. It actually derives, as a lot of classical languages do, from a root. And the root here means to grow something, to bring it into being, to help it into existence. Just as you will plant a seed, water it, tend it, and hopefully watch it flower, grow up into your vegetables or your beautiful flowers or whatever it may be, it requires cultivating, doesn't it? So if you're saying this to somebody within an ancient agrarian society, they would understand very clearly what you meant by this. And what the Buddha is actually saying to each of us is this quality, sati, is something you can cultivate. You can grow. You can actually not meditate. I mean, I don't know about you, but every time I use the word meditation, particularly when somebody knocks at the door and tries to sell me something, I go, yeah, I'll go away and meditate on it. Which generally means I'm not going to do anything at all. Whereas what this is saying actually is you can bring something into being in your life. You can change it. Yeah? Sometimes not radically, but you can start to affect little changes. Just like, and this requires a degree of patience, doesn't it? Just like when you're growing, your vegetable from seed, you don't keep pulling it up to see how it's doing. You've got to have the patience to trust that it's growing. And so this is a practice that we can engage in. Now the practice itself starts with a process of becoming aware of what's going on. What's actually happening right now. Not what you would like to happen, that's planning again. What's actually going on? So if we were doing a little kind of, just a little practice here at the moment, it'd be, well, what's going on for you now? What are your thoughts? What's your emotions? What's going on in your body? Are you noticing comfort, discomfort? What's actually happening for you right now? And the Buddha very cleverly directs our attention, as we do in these present practices, onto experiences which are happening in this present moment. I don't know if you've noticed that when you concentrate or use the breath as an object of cultivating our mindfulness by focusing on the breath is never a past object. It's never a past breath or a future breath. It's always the breath of this moment, isn't it? However it comes to you. Now it might be short, you might have breathing difficulties, however that breath is at this moment. Also, if you notice with the body, and because the breath and body are very tightly interrelated here, the body is always present moment experience. It was never yesterday's body or tomorrow's body. It's the body of this moment, of what's going on. So the initial stages of this practice are to get us to be able to see what's going on in this moment, to literally almost start to touch, almost palpate what's actually happening in your experience at this moment. Now, I would actually say, and this is something for you to test out for yourself, this is fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating, what's actually going on in this moment. It might not sound it, but there is actually an awful lot going on that actually passes us by in our normal, speedy planning, thinking about the past existence. So we miss all sorts of things. Things that actually can give us meaning, because if I'm tied up with planning, I perhaps don't see the beautiful sunset. If I'm tied up with, thinking over something in the past that I feel resentful about, I don't experience the beauty of something. a conversation, being with somebody, or simply being here at all. Yeah? So I miss out on so much in my distracted mind. Now that distracted mind, I'm not being condemnatory about this because there's nothing to be condemnatory about. This is how our minds go. This is fantastic. This is a really useful experience, isn't it? That ability, particularly if we think about the planning dimension, the ability to solve problems and all of that, that's a fantastic ability of our human minds to be able to do this. However, the question is, do you want to be doing it all the time, particularly even when you're in bed? Yeah? Do you want to be doing it when you're eating your meal? Do you want to be doing that when you're with your loved one? Yeah? Planning something in the future, trying to solve a problem. And it infects all sorts of aspects of our lives so that we lose touch, literally, with our bodies. We lose touch with our sense of being here, which is an embodied being here. Yeah. I mean, there's a as you know, some of you know, I work in Oxford. There's a saying that goes around about Oxford professors. Why do Oxford professors have bodies? Yeah. It's to get their brains to meetings. Yeah. There's a lot in that we can be so tied up in our minds that we lose a sense of our fundamental connectedness to this world, to the source of meaning often in this world. You know, something that gives us direct meaning through our senses here. And this is that sense of simple awareness that the Buddha is trying to bring us back to. You know, bring us back to what is going on in this present moment. So how does it feel to sit on your chair at this moment? What are the pressure points that you can feel? Can you feel your clothing touching your body? Can you feel the sensations of this breath at this moment? You know, these are not earth-shattering revelations, are they? Yet in many ways they are, because we do it so rarely. We've lost touch with it. I mean, James Joyce, in one of his short stories, Dubliners, some of you might know, talks about a Mr. Duffy who lived at some distance from his body. You know? And many of us can do that. I mean, personally, I mean, a very personal reflection here, but I find this very sad, that we are so disembodied often, that in a way we almost overcompensate by going into these complete body fanaticisms to try and compensate for this lack of balance between body and mind, between our intellectual, rational capacities and our sense of really feeling through the body, being able to see, being able to hear, being able to taste, to touch. You know? Think of how much meaning, when a person loses a sense, when you lose your sight, when you, I mean, particularly actually the olfactory, when you lose your sense of smell, you know, because smell and taste are so, you know, scientifically interlinked. You know, we lose, in a sense, a huge dimension of our world, don't we? Yet, in a way, we've already lost that when we're not there for it. When we're not there for it. And so the Buddha is really recommending, as does these contemporary-based approaches, that we come back to that fundamental experience. So we start off, actually, with something that's derived from the ancient tradition, which was particularly there in the Burmese tradition of Buddhism, which is called body scanning, or body sweeping. It's done very fast, usually, in this tradition, but it's to get in touch and see what's going on in the body when you sweep your mind through your body. See what's going on, what's pleasant and unpleasant in your experience at this moment. You know, did my knees ache? Does it feel good? Does it feel unpleasant? You know, what's going on? Again, it's an inquiry, isn't it? It's not saying this will feel unpleasant. It's not saying this will feel good. That's why it's an experiment. It's the come and see again. And the coming and seeing is coming back to your own experience and seeing what's going on. I want to touch on another aspect of this because, again, I think this has often been wrongly approached in the Western world, is that the idea is that is what mindfulness is. Just simply seeing. You know, if you sit with it long enough, it's going to solve itself. You know? And actually, I've heard these phrases sometimes and seen them written in books, you know. Simply sit with it. Or what if it's the most painful thing you've ever had happen to you, if it's trauma? You know? Perhaps there's some of you out there who are therapists who probably know that's not a good idea, necessarily. So actually the Buddha speaks about very much knowing, in a sense, who are your friends and who are your enemies. He gives similes. He gives throughout the text similes, as many early teachers did. He gives a simile of somebody who stands at the gate of a city. Actually, the gate actually has 6 gates. The city has 6 gates, all of which represent one of the senses, because actually the mind is another sense. It's picking up thought objects. Yeah. Standing at the gate is a gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper's job is to let in the friends of the city and to keep out the enemies. Yeah? To keep them out. And what that's really indicating is sometimes it's useful to know where you don't want to go, isn't it, in your thought processes? If I get on that little tack of resentment, I might end up with fully blown anger or annoyance about something. So it's in a sense being able to track what letting in certain things do, particularly in thought processes. Where is it going to take you? Is it going to be helpful? Is it going to be useful? Is it going to, or is it going to actually make you, in a sense, feel more pain, rather than less? So it's actually this is wisdom. The gatekeeper, by the way, is called sati. It's called mindfulness. That's part of the job of that gatekeeper, that mindfulness, is to know what to let in and what not to. But sometimes, of course, these things get through. No matter how skillful you've become, that they get through. And then you have to have a sense of introspective awareness, knowing in a sense how to deal with that once it's got through. Again, there's a simile used. It's a really interesting simile. It's a simile of an ancient surgeon who's probing for an arrowhead that's stuck in somebody. The shaft has been broken off, but the arrowhead is embedded in somebody. And it's actually using a probe, a surgeon's probe. They still use these today, probably with gunshot wounds today, but to put into the wound, insert into the wound, to find out the dimensions, what shape it is, what form it takes, how deep it's gone, in order to know. They probably use X-rays actually these days, but to know how to extract that arrowhead with the least possible damage. Yeah? So as you can see, it's a simile for saying that something's got through. How am I going to deal with it? What's the most skillful way of dealing with this? And it's the job of mindfulness, again, to probe that, to see what the most skillful thing. It might be to move the mind away to somewhere else. It might be actually to deal with it as it is. So there's no one answer to that question. It's an inquiry that we're engaging in. And then, in this kind of generalised way of looking at the different forms of mindfulness, there's another form which is actually usefully, if you like, cognitively restructuring ourselves or our approaches to life. The classic one for this cognitive restructuring is something called metta. I'm sorry to say it's appallingly translated usually as loving kindness. And I really do mean that, because the original Pali Sanskrit word is derived from a word which means to be friendly towards something. It's developing a boundless sense of friendliness towards your own experiences, even if they're difficult, even if it's that difficult thought arising, but also towards others as well. And in the early stages, it might be as if. So it's actually not about experiencing emotion. I can become and approach something with friendliness more through activity rather than having an emotion. This is what this is being suggested. So being friendly is not necessarily tied to having the emotion of being really friendly, and certainly not loving in this instance. The Buddha says we can befriend our experiences and we can befriend difficult things and people, but we can't necessarily love them. So his kind of cultivation is based on a cultivation of a friendly approach to life and to our experiences, even, if you like, when we're messing up. Yeah? But rather than... We have this really well-developed aspect. I'm sure probably most of you are familiar with it in the West. It's called the inner critic. You know, sits on your shoulder, whispering in your ear, really nasty stuff. Yeah? It's actually saying you can befriend that, even that inner critic. You don't have to see it as an enemy. And in fact, befriending it might actually make it disappear to a certain degree. I wouldn't say entirely. I don't want to be over-optimistic in the West. But we can certainly take a different approach to it. Now, interestingly, there's a very famous sutta. These are just texts, discourses. The words means literally in Pali something well said. There are interesting texts called the Metta Sutta, which is it's one of the oldest texts in the Pali Canon. It refers right back to the origins of Buddhism. You don't find actually in these early texts things like the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, but you do find a discourse on being friendly to things. And when it refers to this, I won't go through the whole text, but when it refers to this, it refers to it as a recollection. So friendliness itself is a mindfulness. What you need to do is recollect it, though, isn't it? Yeah? To be friendly. Now, that's not always easy. I'm not saying it's easy, and the Buddha never said it was easy either. And we certainly don't say in an 8-week mindfulness course this is easy. But we do say it's possible. That we can start to befriend our experience, befriend our thought processes, rather than make enemies out of them. Yeah? Interestingly, in this particular text, the Buddha said there is no better way to live in this world than through metta. Yeah? Not through developing some super hyper intellect or some fantastic esoteric practice, but actually this is the most fundamental way of being in this world, is with a degree of friendliness towards the world, your experience, and others within this world. Yeah? So mindfulness covers not just one thing, not this simply sense of being aware and being in the present, but actually represents a whole series of different strategies, and I've only given you a very brief taste of these. Most of which, again coming back to the title, most of which can be found embedded in our 8-week programs. Not explicitly, because that's not the job, but implicitly in the attitudes that we're trying to get people to cultivate. Yeah? And that's what it's about. It's not saying, well, kind of come along and believe in this and do this through belief, but have a look and have a see and have a go. And actually in that having a go, you're cultivating a particular attitude towards life and your experience, which is far, far, this is me, this is not the courses, I think is far more enriching. It brings us to life. One of the things I've found astonishing, when I first became involved in this in Oxford, and just a very personal reflection here, one of the astonishing things I found was the degree of change you could see in people even over an 8-week course. And I say even because those of you who are involved in the Buddhist tradition, you know that what we generally refer to as meditation is something which is a lifetime process, something that you engage in and is encouraged for you to engage in on a daily basis and to cultivate in that way over the course of your life in various situations, often in retreat situations, dedicating a lot of time to this. So actually to say, well, over an 8-week course, people have the practices within the 2 hours a week, but they have the practices also that they're asked to do at home, but it still doesn't amount to a lot. But you see a tremendous amount of change. Yeah. There was a conference recently which was in America, and one of the neuroscientists who's looking particularly at brain scans of effects on meditators of doing some of these practices, says even if you limited it to 5 to 10 minutes a day, you see noticeable changes in the cortex. Yeah? Can't exactly say what the changes are, but there are changes that are going on in the cortex. Yeah? So it's changing something. Even if we can't scientifically say exactly what's going on at this moment in time, there are changes taking place, even in that brief period of time. It's nothing much, is it? 5 to 10 minutes a day. Most of you probably waste that, as I do, in a day. But dedicating to that process of cultivation, changes can take place. And this is the hopeful thing about engaging in these ancient practices in a modern world, is not just that they are belief systems that we key into, but they're something that we can bring into our life that can really change our lives. And the taste is, if you like, in the doing of it, not in having a set of propositions about it. So it's very, very much a practice, and it's dedicated, I think, to many of the problems that we have in the contemporary world, which actually are not new problems. They're ancient problems. I mean, if I think about probably the most translated text in the Buddhist world, something which is known as the Dhammapada, it's a set of aphorisms basically culled from the rest of this vast amount of text that's there in the early Buddhist tradition, we find this little aphorism which has said, hatred is never cured by hatred. Hatred is only cured by non-hatred, which actually implies, friendliness. This attitude of friendliness. And out of that friendliness grows compassion. Out of this sense of being with others, observing that it's not just my predicament, that I have irritation, I have anger, I have pain, I have loss, all the things that I kind of started with, but that also you have it as well. This is our shared humanity, isn't it? That's where the compassion comes from, by becoming aware of myself and what's actually happening here, and finding new approaches to be able to deal with this, to, in a sense, stop the sense of dukkering, what I call the optional dukkha, not the stuff that simply happens, but the stuff we laid on ourselves. Some of you will know there's an image about this. I'll just give you this little image, which is it's an image of 2 arrows, although I think it's a bit sort of underestimated here, which says there is the first arrow you're hit with. This is again a simile out of these early texts. And then there's the arrow you willfully push into yourself. So not only is there pain, I make pain out of pain. I think it's more like there's the one arrow that hits you, and then there's the 100 that you push into yourself. Which is, why is this happening to me? This is really annoying. I don't want this to happen. This shouldn't be happening to me at all. All the stuff that goes on for us. It's saying that we don't have to engage in that. There is another way of dealing with life and the problems of life. But it's not, in a sense, going to, wipe away the difficulties. What it's going to give us is more constructive ways of being able to hold the difficulties which are life. However, there's another aspect I think that mindfulness opens up, because I think that would be big progress if we moved in that direction, to beginning to see and appreciate and hold the difficulties in different ways. But it also opens us up to something which gets missed within the difficulties, which is actually the joyfulness that's often there in life. There's a little Sri Lankan thing I translated once, which says, life is a play of joy and sorrow. Notice that. It's not one or the other. It's not all unalloyed joy, and it's certainly not generally all unalloyed sorrow. It's a kind of mix of it, and sometimes one will get predominant and the other will get predominant, but it's going and it's fluctuating, it's moving between the two. But particularly when we get caught up with the sorrowful dimensions, or the difficult, or what I call the difficult dimensions of life, we don't see the joyful. We miss out, we lose out on the meanings. What mindfulness also is engaged in, I haven't got time to go into this because I'm kind of drawing to give you some chance to have the right of reply, as I would say, about some of this, is that this is not new. It's been going on, I think, as long as human beings have been on this planet in some way. But what the Buddha is attempting to do is develop this capacity that we all have, going back to what I was saying earlier on. This capacity that is there for us, but we need to cultivate it. It's not just going to come about. We need to cultivate it. And in many ways also, I find this really interesting. You know, parliamentarians are doing this as well. We have a kind of, one of my colleagues at Oxford is teaching, well, he's taught so far 121 parliamentarians to do some of these practices in a very basic way. And then there's a whole load of support staff as well. It's a kind of a little bit, I hesitate to say this, so don't tell anybody else, which is it's a bit of a Trojan horse. Because actually once you start to practice in this way, so when you start to see these things, some of the things that are often offered out in our societies, again, speaking very much in the contemporary world, as being the solutions to your problems, no longer seem the solutions. And I think here particularly of materiality. We live in cultures, and again, you have to look at it amongst yourself, and your own behaviours, but also amongst those we know, is if you think you can solve the problem and become happy by having stuff, then actually this starts to really deflate that idea. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have things, that's not really what this is about, but don't, in a sense, misplace your happiness into that. What these things will give you is pleasure. They won't necessarily give you happiness. The kind of happiness that the Buddha is talking about is a contentment that's coming from an inner resource. It's an inner resource. It's not coming from the outside. So often we're looking for even others to make us happy. What a death knell of a relationship. Make me happy. Happiness can be formed out of a relationship, but one other person cannot make you happy. Particularly if you're determined not to be. And things can't necessarily make you happy. Again, the Buddha uses a simile for this. He says, and again, ancient simile, he says it's like a dog sitting outside of a butcher's shop. And the butcher, what he does is throws the dog a bone that's got no flesh on it, but just merely smeared with blood. But the dog keeps chewing the bone again and again and again and again, trying to find nutrition out of it, trying to get some satisfaction out of it. And in many ways, I think that can be likened sometimes to our approaches to material society. We keep doing it, because it's the only thing we know a lot of the time, and we keep doing it again and again, thinking that this time it will work. If I get that, I will be happy. Have you noticed that mythology? Generally what happens is, again, you've got to check this out for yourself, but I would suggest what tends to happen is you get what you want, it's going to make you happy, you stay happy for a reason, a little period of time, 10 minutes, and then you're going, if only I had that, I would be happy. And it goes, in other words, it's a sort of endlessness to it, an endlessness to that. I'm going to kind of just draw this to a conclusion now, which is just to give you a quote from the Buddha, again from this very earliest strata of the text. And this is what mindfulness, in a sense, is really directed at. And this is the Buddha personally speaking. When I read this in the original, rather than in this translation of mine, I hear really his voice coming through quite strongly. You don't often a lot in these texts. They're kind of really well worked over and formulaic. But here it comes through very strongly. He says, fear comes to one who embraces violence. And I don't think he just means physical violence, he means verbal violence, what he calls the dagger behind the teeth. It's an interesting metaphor. Look at people quarrelling. Let me tell you of the strong agitation that I felt, seeing people struggling like fish in shallow water with enmity towards one another. I became fearful. Wanting a safe place to shelter, you can think of all those material things that we might be after. Wanting a safe place to shelter, I saw that the world lacked substance. There was not one part of it that was changeless. Everything was changing. Seeing people trapped in this mutual enmity, I grew dissatisfied. And then when I looked closely, I saw in their hearts a barb like a fishhook, buried in their hearts that was difficult to perceive. It is this barb that impels people to run in all directions. It is this barb that causes so much pain. Once it is pulled out, the running ceases, as does the exhaustion that accompanies it. It's almost modern in the way it suggests. I don't know if you hear that, but kind of that last bit, people running in all directions, trying to solve things, trying to find some degree of happiness. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the Buddha is saying, actually, the places they're looking for it are not out there. They're in here. And what we need to do is gather our minds in a certain way, begin to learn to settle, to slow things down, and to find out that actually the present doesn't just only hurt, that there is also a lot of other things going on there as well that we don't see when we're focused outside, looking into the future for something to make us happy. So this is, I think, the message that this ancient tradition brings into a contemporary world. Not all of it is explicit within the courses that we teach, but much of it is implicitly there in the instruction and in a sense, the orientation that we're trying to get people to cultivate in their lives. And I shall finish there because I could say a lot more, and I won't. Thank you.
Well, there is 15 minutes for the right to reply. So,
I hope you don't mind, I'm going to sit down for this bit.
Would anybody wish to put their hand up to address a question or comment to John Peacock? Yes.
Thanks very much, that was great. I'm quite interested in the practical application of what you've been talking about, because as you say, most of us live these very busy lives and it's very difficult to kind of incorporate and integrate a regular practice. And the bit which interests me is whether one pursues what seems to have been happening recently, which is, if you like, the secular manifestation of mindfulness and secular practice, or whether there is value in thinking about its roots, its origins, and, if you like, its sacred past and all that goes with it, and kind of how one decides.
Okay, it's a big question. Did everybody hear it, or at least bits of it? Really about a question of the place of secular mindfulness within the contemporary world and whether one pursues that or one pursues a more traditional approach. Yeah. Well, I think where you started off was probably the very right place. This is a practice. What I think... Let's talk about the ancient tradition first of all. I think what the Buddha is giving us is a set of skills. What he's trying to encourage. In the Greek world, they call this phronesis. I don't know, some of you might be familiar with this word, which was practical wisdom. A practical wisdom, not an intellectual wisdom, but a practical wisdom. And I think it's the kind of wisdom that the carpenter has, the really skilled craftsperson. And what he's trying to say is actually we can develop something like this practical wisdom in our ordinary lives. So it begins as a practice. But, of course, and this is the difficulty, isn't it, when we start off engaging in any practice like this, we're sort of on the very lowest run of apprenticeship at that stage. So it feels difficult. Yeah? If you've ever tried to learn a skill, look at how the person who's accomplished it, how easy it looks until you try to do it. Then you suddenly become aware that actually, and particularly with these craft, interestingly in these ancient texts, the Buddha uses a lot of craft skills. A lot of craftspeople in there, in these early strata of texts. So he doesn't give intellectuals, he gives people who are really grounded in a craft. Let's take carpentry. Somebody who can work with the grain of something, work with the wood, feel how to move with that material to create something beautiful out of it. And that's a real skill, isn't it, to be able to do that, or to play a musical instrument really beautifully. Yet you start off fumbling. You start off making mistakes. You start off not being skilled. But that's where we have to start. That's the first thing. It's a practice. In the end, I think it's up to you which version you take. What we now have available to us, I think, in the Western world, which I think is very useful, is within the mindfulness-based secular world, is practices that people don't actually have to say, I submit or sign up to all the aspects of the Buddhist tradition. So it makes it much more open. And as I said, it's a human practice. It's not a Buddhist practice. Now, if one wants to then go on and look at all the Buddhist psychological material, the texts, the traditions, the way it's done, that might add something to you particularly. You know, you might, for example, be inspired by Buddhist imagery, as many people are. But then again, you might not be, and it might not even be your tradition. You might come from a completely different faith tradition, you know, but might also still find this useful. You know? I mean, it's interesting that one of the founders of the secular-based mindfulness tradition, Mark Williams, who I worked with for many years, is actually also an ordained minister within the Anglican Church, as well as being a professor of clinical psychology. You know, yet, and in his initial stages, he was resistant to looking at mindfulness as a practice. That was coming from one of the other founders of this. But now he's really integrating this into what he perceives as his Christian practice within it. So if you don't want to take on all the trappings of Buddhism, and, you know, Buddhism, I mean, I actually don't like the word Buddhism, because it actually covers up a huge multitude of sins, in a way, because it's a 2,500-year-old tradition. It's like sort of talking about, you know, I think we know what we mean when we talk about Christianity or Islam. Islam has an enormous historical tradition behind it, as does Christianity, with all the different theological perspectives that arise and practices that arise from the cultures that it's taken root in, the places it's gone to. And Buddhism is no different from that. So again, it becomes, which Buddhism do you choose in the end? You know? And I think that's a personal choice, you know, whether it's uplifting. But I do think that the most important thing is that practice. Without that, it's nothing. Actually, the Buddhist tradition fell into that big trap itself. It thought it could think its way to reality rather than actually engage in anything practical. This wonderful edifice arises out of it called Buddhist philosophy. But much of it, and many of the debates within that, are actually very intellectual and have nothing to do with practical matters that people live. So the practice, and what I find in these early texts, and this is why I primarily teach out of these early texts, is it's very practically based. There's not one thing that's in those early texts that the Buddha talks about that doesn't have a practical application in your life. Yeah? So it has to start with your investigating your own experience. I don't know how that sounds to everybody, you know, because obviously I don't know many of you out there, but in a way it hands back authority to you and says, it's actually your experience, investigate your experience, but you have to do it to gain anything from this. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, it's kind of a response to it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question.
Yep.
One of the advantages of being part of the Buddhist group is that you do have the Sangha, the support of the other members who are trying to practice. Whereas what happens with the 8-week course? Do you carry on meeting?
Actually, that's an interesting question. I'm going to stand up again. I can see everybody better there. I mean, it's an interesting question because, in a way, I mean, I'll get to your specific part of the question that you just asked, but in a way, what's overtaken us with secular mindfulness is it's become far more successful, far more quickly than anybody predicted. You know, it's taken off, as we would say in the West, far quicker than I think anybody really imagined it was going to. And as a result of that, we're trying now to, if you like, create a structure that then holds people once they've done an 8-week course. So in Oxford we have sitting groups and that who meet regularly on a weekly basis to come together to practice, and they would come from the various different, sometimes clinical groups and sometimes just general groups, to come together to do that. We're still creating that. Yeah. So actually, as you say, I think the Buddhist tradition has a distinct advantage about that, because that was always part of it. You know, there was 3 jewels that was spoken about, Triratna, which is actually, you know, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. Yeah, and the Sangha was as important, the sense of the collectivity of people who were practicing and exploring in similar ways. And I really do emphasise the exploring, because it's not about, I think, so much about what you believe as about what you're doing together and how you're exploring this material together. So we're trying to create it. We're not there yet. We're not even there yet, in some senses, in supporting many of the people who are teaching this, let alone those who've done the 8-week courses. But we're trying to create that at the moment. Yeah.
Yes.
Talk about the way that the course, or indeed Buddhism itself, is taking off.
Mm.
And I wondered how you measure that. I mean, certainly, as John said, the fact that there's so many of us in this room tonight is a kind of an indicator of what the Bath Buddhist Group has done in the last few decades. But what I'm wondering is how you actually measure the extent of difference Buddhism potentially can make. Because it seems to me that people like Sam Cooke wrote a great song in the early 60s, "A Change is Gonna Come."
Mm-hmm.
And everybody, certainly if you're black in America, you're still waiting for that goddamn change to come.
Mm.
And I'm sort of, I want to know sort of really where the change action from Buddhism comes from. How do you measure it?
Mm. I don't think this is not a quantifiable thing. It's a quality thing. You know, if you're talking about scientific studies, it's very difficult, as you probably know, to get money to do quality studies as opposed to quantifiable studies. Really, really difficult to get that. You won't find many funders who are prepared to do that. How do you therefore measure it? I think really, in that scientific sense, is really difficult to measure. But I would still say that there is a kind of litmus test for this. And perhaps it's more to do with individuals than groups. Has this decreased the level of, I'm going to use the Pali term, dukkha, in your life? Yeah. Even if it's, I get slightly less irritated in this situation than I used to do. Yeah. I think also it has another aspect which actually doesn't get talked much about in secular mindfulness, which actually makes one look at your ethics, your ethical ways of living. And this is, within the Buddha's teaching, this is absolutely paramount. You know, the measurable thing is how well do you behave. Now, I don't mean in a normative sense of behaviour, but how compassionate are you? How kind are you? Are your words harsh, or are they actually helping in some dimension? So there's a huge ethical area. I mean, I won't go into all of it, and I'm sure you know it anyway. You know, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, there's 5 precepts that the ordinary person's expected to live by. You know, those are, they can be read as sort of normative injunctions, prescriptive, but I think we lose their value because actually they help you to inquire into your ethics. You know, so in other words, if you take the first, just take the first one, which is a rule of training to refrain from harming living things. You know, that's enormous because it's not saying just don't kill, it's saying don't harm. And what does harm mean? Well, is it that harsh word that you speak? Is it that dismissive gesture? It means really reflecting on our harm. And actually, you're a living being too. What harm do you do yourself in the ways that you live? Because the Buddha is very much about also a sense of balance and care for ourselves with care for others and care for others with care for ourselves. And so this is really, really important of looking at the ethical dimensions that rise out of it, which actually often in Western Buddhism is often focused on meditation, but very little on ethics. And ethics, I think, is crucial to it. And what we learn out of, I think, practices like mindfulness in a big sense is actually sometimes when we're doing things wrong. Yeah? Because it actually increases dukkha rather than decreases it. So that's the measurement, I think, in that. And sometimes it's for an individual who's practicing, sometimes it's very difficult even for them to discern it. That's changing. The amount of times I've given retreats and had interviews with people, and they'll say to me, I've been practicing now for 20 years, I've been meditating for 20 years, my mind's still all over the place when I'm doing the meditation, and then I go to them, well, what else in your life has changed? And then you'll find that there's an enormous amount of changes that have taken place in the rest of their life. That's, I think, where the measurement is. And certainly not necessarily within the meditation session, within the mindfulness session or whatever. Here, it's actually in what changes are there in your life. How is pain decreasing or increasing in your life? This is how we measure it, I think. I'll tell you one final little anecdote about this. It was really funny. In Oxford, in the Department of Psychiatry, which is strangely enough where I work, one of the professors there was doing some mindfulness practice, and he said to his wife, I have to be practicing for 2 months. He said, I think I'll give this up, I'm not getting anywhere with this. I'm really not getting anywhere at all. I could use the time more valuably, because I think he was devoting at least an hour a day to doing it. I could use the time much more valuably, and sort of doing some of the administration that doesn't get done and things like this. And his wife looked at him and said, please don't. I think those are where you see the changes. Actually, others reflecting back at you sometimes.
Well, thank you, John. I'm going to take the microphone away from you because
you can see I was about to go on.
Because we've reached our limit, and it would be unfortunate if there was an ugly scene if we were all thrown out. But I think I speak on behalf of everybody here in thanking you so much. I didn't expect, when we invited John, although I'd heard him speak before and have some recordings of his talks, I didn't expect that we would celebrate the 40 years of Buddhism in Bath by having a speaker who said he didn't like the term Buddhism. But, as it turns out, that was spot on, as, in my view, was everything else that you had to say tonight, John. I'm delighted that we've recorded the talk. I made some notes for my own benefit, but I shall certainly listen to it again, probably more than once. Thank you so much, John. It really has been a privilege to welcome you here tonight, and it's just been such a rewarding experience.